So my name is Gunjan Sondi. I'm a lecturer in geography at the Open University, and we've organised this workshop as part of a British Academy project that we've received funding for to develop certain platforms and skills, and in fact develop skills further on how to write academic papers, particularly for African scholars, to enable them to publish more widely, particularly in British journals. So that was sort of the background around it. It was really focused at that time and continues to be focused very much around the research theme of international student migration, because that's the work we're doing. But due to the very increased demand for the session, which we had done first time last year in December, we decided to open it up to the wider African scholars and not limiting it just to international student migration researchers. So this is now the second workshop we've run. The last one, as I mentioned, was in December 2020. And we ended up having a lot of people express interest, and so we decided we'd run this one again. This is, in a way, a second workshop in a series of workshops that we're doing, all around how to write academic papers, developing the skills, and how to develop that academic paper and the various components of it. So this is an overview session, and then we'll have a series of sessions that focus on literature review, and then another session that looks at how to link theory to literature and empirical, and you know, the various other components that go into producing an academic literature academic paper. And to help us with lots of this is we have Parvati Raghuram from the Open University, who's a professor in geography, and Marcus Brainers, who is an associate professor as well at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. They both work very intensely and very heavily. They're involved in projects across countries in Africa, and for several years, so this isn't necessarily something new. But based on the feedback from the colleagues as well, they are going to be sharing their experiences and tips on how to do this, how to go about producing an academic paper. We already have about 50 participants, and we're about 5 minutes in. So I think what I'll do at this time is switch over to hand this over to Parvati to start the discussion, start the session. So we'll have Parvati speaking first, followed by about 10 minutes of Q&A. We will have Marcus speaking next, which will also then be followed by another Q&A session, 10-minute Q&A session. And then the last 40 minutes or so of the workshop would really be looking at common issues, and then for you to come back to us with questions that you may have, any clarifications that you require. Parvati, do you want to start?
Hello, hi, and welcome everyone. It's great to have you here. I'm Parvati Raghuram. I'm from the Open University, Professor of Geography and Migration. I've been working on migration for about 20 odd years, and I've published about 100 pieces, I would think, of academic pieces, including 5 books, several special issues that I've edited, and I'm currently editor of 1 journal, 1 book series, and on the editorial board of a number of journals. I cannot remember how many. So I have some experience of academic writing, but also of academic refereeing. Though I must say that increasingly I don't do as much refereeing because I just don't have the time. So what I wanted to do really is to think about, to walk you through with me what I use as some of the basis on which I think we could think about how do we write a paper. So we had this interesting discussion. We said, which comes first, the paper or the journal? And one very esteemed colleague of mine said, actually, I never start writing a paper without knowing which journal it's going to. I think that this is something which has to be right up there. When you start thinking about a paper almost at the same time, you must start thinking about which journal it's going to. Is the journal article the right way to present what you want to present, right? So what's an academic journal article good for? It's good for producing a moderately lengthy piece of thought, which is writing primarily to academic audiences, not always to academic audiences, but primarily to academic audiences, is about 7,000 to 8,000 words long. It gives you an opportunity to develop one idea well, and it is ultimately attempting to change some aspects of academic thought. That's what you're trying to do with a journal article. So the first thing to say is that what you want to write? Why are you writing this specific piece? If you want to reach out to a policy audience, is a policy paper better? Is a blog better? Is an op-ed piece in a journal better? There are different things that you could be writing. You may not be wanting to write you can often write all of these things, right? You can even sometimes write a novel because you want to communicate more than you want to write a journal article. So these are very different things that you might be looking for in your writing practices. But when you start setting out to write a journal article, you need to know that that's what you really do want to write. So the first question I often ask myself is, why am I writing this specific piece? The other thing that I think is that a journal article is very much for me, it's often an eruption of thought. It's like I want to write, and I'm currently working on and some of you are here. Felicity, I saw that you're here, on a team with scholars who are working on migration and inclusive African growth. One of the things that we talked about in this is somebody said, "Oh, this is the paper I'm thinking about, but do you want me to write on something else?" And I say, no. If that's the paper that you're thinking about, that's the one which is inside you, which wants to come out, then write that first, because that's where your head is at. So why are you writing this specific piece? For me, there are several reasons: personal, career related, and relating to communications, why we might want to write a piece. So the first thing is it's the personal. One of them is curiosity. I might have some material that I want to investigate or have investigated because of curiosity that I want to write up. I personally often want to write because I want to right a wrong. I think there's something incorrect or inappropriate or wrong which has been written about, and I want to correct that. And I also sometimes write because I'm angry about something. And so most recently, I was thinking, I had written a piece last year. I think it got published in 2019, called From Asia to the World, right? What has migration what is it that migration scholars in Asia have written that other people across the globe have actually used, right? But then working with the African scholars, I thought actually working with African scholars, it gives me a totally different perspective. And I have something very different to say about what Africa offers to the world in terms of academic contributions, in my case, to the literature on migration. So it's a paper that I think is a gap, that I think identifies something which is really important to say. And it's really in my head all the time. I keep thinking, oh, this is the subsection. That's what I need to do, and so on and so forth. So there's a personal thing about curiosity, about wanting to fill a gap, identifying that they're all talking about something, but actually that's not exactly how it happens, right? Now, the point about this is not exactly how it happens is very important for African scholars, right? Very, very important. And some of you I see are from other parts of the global south, like in India and so on and so forth. I think about the practicalities. Think about, is the stuff that you're reading in the literature exactly right? Is this true? Is this how it's lived through? Because if it's not, then that's a gap only you can fill. People in the global north can't fill that gap. So write back. So that's the other thing, is that you're writing back. You're writing back with true voice, with authoritative voice from the south, right? Because you're seeing, don't repeat what you see in journals and try to say, actually, this is what I've read, so I'm going to repeat it. And let me give you an example of this, which is that Gunjan and I have been doing some work on migrant women in the Indian IT sector. Right? There are a lot of migrant women in the Indian IT sector. And there were many, many papers which say that there are very few women in the Indian IT sector, because people are so used to thinking that India is really terrible about having gender equality. But actually, in India, there are 35% of all people in the IT sector are women, and only 14% in the UK. So people, so when we tell Indians, actually look around an Indian office, you'll see so many women. You look across a UK office, you'll never find so many women in IT, right? Uh, that's the first time they realize, oh, you're right. Actually, we've lived with this, but we have not realized it's like this. So be conscious of the fact that you know something that other people may not know. So that's the personal element. The second is the career element. Many of us also write papers because we, because of we need it for our promotions. And the third reason is for an audience, because we want to communicate something. We want to write. We like the business of writing, but we also want to communicate something. The journal themselves have different audiences, and you need to think about what kinds of journals exist and what are the different audiences. So there are so-called international journals, which are truly international, and in migration studies, I can say International Migration is a truly international journal, compared to, say, journals which are run from a country like the UK, like the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, and they want to be international, but they don't always make it to internationalism. At most, they go to Europe. Sometimes they'll go to US. They don't really become international. And then you have pan-continental journals like African journals, or you might have journals like the Nigerian journals. And the important thing is, which is the one that you want to speak to? The audience and the nature of the paper will vary. So you need to think, if you want to write about a Nigerian case and you want to publish it in a British journal because it is prestigious, why would the British people be interested in this article? So why would anybody read it? And so thinking through the article, and we will do much more on this in the next session, is the conceptual argument is the one which will travel, right? The empirical case hardly travels, right? So one of the things is, if you say that, okay, you have a study on Ghanaian market women, right? So the question is, why would this be of interest to a European audience? Just because you want to write it and publish it in a European journal, you have to think it may not travel. But what probably travels in this is the fact that that perhaps that entrepreneurship of that kind is a very important set of activities that everybody needs to think through when they think about women migrants. Yeah. So you need to think about what is generalizable to the audience and what is specific to you, and you might know it and you might think it's relevant, but it may not be relevant when you write it into international journals. There are also very important differences between policy journals and academic journals, and there are some mixed journals. So most of the journals we often see are academic journals, which has very specific implications. You begin with the literature review, you end with the implications for the literature, not for policy, right? Because the journal is pushing academic thought. It is not. So no police person is going to read it. No development specialist who's on the field is going to read it, or very few. The people who are going to read it are other academics. So you're trying to change their thoughts when you write the paper, not policy. So, and this therefore has implications of why would anybody read it? So when you choose a journal, you need to think about the national, international scope, the policy academic scope, and whether it's a very theoretical journal or whether it's looking for empirical case studies as well. And there are big differences. Yes, some papers hardly ever take empirical case studies. Some of the progress papers, like the Progress in Human Geography, Progress in Physical Geography, Progress in Development Studies, they are state-of-the-art papers. They will not state of the literature. Yeah, so they will not take papers with empirical case studies. Other people, actually look for empirically led theoretical papers, and others are happy to take empirical papers with some theoretical work. Don't send it to the wrong type of journal, right? Because if you do, it won't get accepted and it will get desk rejected. So when we think about how to choose a journal, you need to think of all of these things. I know many of us are encouraged to think about impact factors. But impact factors are ultimately a game, right? It is about the fact that two of you will apply, it's in the last 2 years, whether you've had enough number of papers and how have they self-cited. So for instance, a journal like Economic Geography has got high impact factor because they really encourage their authors to cite each other. And those impact factors are based upon citations. So there's all kinds of things that happen. And the second thing is when you're writing, ultimately you're not writing for anybody. You're writing for your paper to be well read. Just because there are other articles in that journal which are well read, that doesn't mean yours will be well read. Because yours will be well read if you have got people who might be interested in your paper reading that journal. So for instance, if I think that, yeah, this development studies journal is very important, but that's not the audience for this paper. So the question I often ask myself is, whose minds do I want to change by writing this? If I'm going to spend time writing 8,000 words, I must know that I will really influence and affect some people's thought, right? So I choose a journal based upon that. But sometimes journals also choose you. So for instance, I'm following a debate in a journal called Geoforum, right? And I'm watching one paper and then another 2 years later, another paper, then 2-3 papers, within the next 6 months on this. And I'm thinking, really, this is not true. My empirical realities suggest that actually this is not what should be written about. And you've really not understood it. That journal has chosen me and said, write back to me and tell me that I'm doing something wrong. So if you look through your own reference list for your paper, you will know which is the journal, because it's the journal in which you have lots of citations. If you have a lot of citations from a particular journal, that's probably the literature that you're writing back to. And that's probably the journal to then write. So you write your paper, and we will go through, Marcus will go through in more detail about what to write in the paper. But what happens to journals articles when submitted? So journal articles get submitted, and they go into what is called manuscript central. In my case, very often the papers go into some. The editor then identifies and looks for 2 or 3 reviewers to review it. They sent out a review, and they often take about 6 to 8 weeks for the reviews to come back. The reviews then are seen, and a decision is made on what to do with that paper, right? And the types of decisions which are often made are either accept, which is very, very rare, with accept with no changes. I think out of those 100 odd papers that I've written, I think I got 1 accept with no changes. And then you have many which come with minor revisions, where they say, oh, we want to make we want you to make some small number of revisions. And then many go through major revisions. And major revisions is when they say that actually there's a mix match between your concept and your empirical material and your theoretical materials. You really need to completely rethink it. But having said all of this, most often 85% of all papers are desk rejected. And desk rejection happens when you have submitted an article to a journal for which it is not fit. For instance, they might return it to you and say, sorry, we are not accepting papers we don't think that this is worth sending out to review because your focus is not our area of interest, or the paper is really not well developed enough. So some of those are qualitative change. Sometimes it's about quality. Very often it's about quality, and sometimes it's about fit. So 85% of articles do not even go into the review process. Yeah, they get what is called desk rejected. So how do you get a paper beyond desk reject? That's the really important one. You must try and make sure that your paper is not desk rejected. Once you get it through, very often if you're African scholars, not always, people will try to give you major revisions, because people will also often use this as an opportunity to give you feedback, to help you to rewrite the paper. And people are looking for African scholars, right, to be writing into their journals. So they will try to encourage you. But most papers don't get to this point. So how do you get a paper through beyond desk project? I think look at the journal. Make sure that the journal is the right journal for you and for your paper. Secondly, make sure that it definitely makes some kind of makes some conceptual insights, right? It's got to have some degree of originality, and the originality should go beyond the empirical. So to say that my case study is important is not enough, because nobody really cares about your case study beyond the point. It's what can the case study tell you? What can the case study tell everybody? And now think, here I am sitting in a grey, cold house in the UK. What's your lovely case study of warm Accra going to tell me about sitting here, right? So you really need to focus on that communication and think, yes, this is still relevant for that group because it will help them to think better about their work. So you need to think about its relevance and its scope beyond the case study, and that scope must go beyond policy. So if you say that there is a policy relevance to this, and that, yeah, but the policy relevance is for Ghana, right? So write it into a Ghanaian journal, because after all, that they are the people who will read this and for whom it will be relevant. We are in the UK, we will not be able to, act on that. So those are the kinds of really practical questions that you must ask yourself when you submit a paper. Okay, over to you.
So at this time, what I think we'll do is we'll take about 10 minutes of Q&A. I would request if everyone could use if they could just put in the chat, or if you, yes, if you can indicate in the chat that you would like to ask a question, and I can circulate that.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My question is, okay, what she just gave us basically the purpose of what the journal article is all about. I hope you can hear me. So is it the same? Okay, I want to ask that the methods, or like what she said basically, is how we can write a journal and then it gets past the text rejection to make your work authentic, that people will change the minds of others. Okay, enlighten other people that don't know what is going on that you know on about. So is it the same thing as writing a research paper, an academic research paper?
Yes, I'm talking about a journal article as an academic research paper.
Parvati Abiola has asked a question, which is, what is your view on writing papers to build up a researcher profile on a platform like ResearchGate?
I have never done that, because I have never felt that I had the time to do that as well as write the academic papers for the journals. I think I do submit papers onto ResearchGate once they are published, but never only on ResearchGate. I think ResearchGate has been used and can be used as a repository for certain kinds of data and for other pieces, but not as a primary academic piece.
Thanks for that. The next question is from Felicity, which is, how do you handle reviewers who push you to include a research approach, whether it's qualitative, quantitative, or mixed, and that you're not comfortable with once your paper has been accepted?
Hi, Felicity. Nice to see you here. Felicity is my colleague from Kenya.
Okay.
So usually once it's accepted, they will not ask you to change your method. It is the way that it goes is once you have the paper, it goes to major revisions. Then you get it sent. You get time to do your major revisions, and at that stage they may ask you for methodological changes. This is if you do not have the data of the kind, like if you have quantitative data and you don't have the qualitative data, then you have probably chosen the wrong journal, because very often some journals have particular tendencies. They look for certain things. You look at a journal like World Development, and I was talking about this recently with someone, might have been at our MAG meeting even, Felicity, but World Development is looking for, world. So they're looking for data which is across 110 countries, right? And if you try to submit something which is across 8 countries or 10 countries, they often won't take it because they're looking for big data sets, right? So, but there are mixed methods journals, and most are mixed method journals. So look at the methodologies which are usually being used in a particular journal and submit accordingly. So don't, this is again why choosing the right journal is so crucial.
Thank you so much for that, Felicity, for that question.
Thank you very much. First, I want to especially appreciate you for organizing this. Sincerely, from the bottom of our hearts, we appreciate this kind gesture. Also looking forward to the next edition. It's a good one. You are really walking the talk. My question is this. How do you get updated of Scopus Index Journal on your feed? How do you get updated of it time after time? Secondly, how do you differentiate a journal that is not a standard journal, an international journal that is not standard, compared to a journal that is an impact factor? How do you differentiate it? Thank you very much.
So I don't often look at impact factors, to be fair. Occasionally I do, usually because I'm working with some scholars who are quite interested in that. I often think about audiences. I'm very bothered about my paper, and I think, who is going to read this? So I sometimes publish in population space and place because I know that I have a following there. I know people read my papers there. And also, more importantly, the people whom I want to influence are reading that journal. So I know that they are roughly the people whom I want to speak to. So very often the papers I'm citing are from there. So for me, Scopus is not such a big concern, but I'm sure there are technical ways of setting that up, which I'm not sure how one does. Gunjan is much more technically proficient than I, and I've completely forgotten your other question, Kingsley. Sorry.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you.
What was your other question?
My other question is this. How do you differentiate a journal, an international journal that is not standard precisely talking about impact factor, or that is being listed on a Scopus Index journal? How do you differentiate it? Because if you go to the cyberspace today, you come across all kinds of journals across the globe. So sometimes if you are not being careful, you published in a journal that are not being listed in Scopus Index or impact factor with a very high rate. Then when it gets to the time for you to make use of it in promotion or other things of endeavors, you find yourself in a mix that particular journal is not being listed. At the same time, that journal is not an original journal of standard of repute. So how do you differentiate it? Thank you.
Sorry, is it okay if we answer this question at the end of the session? I think because there are, I realize we've got a whole host of questions, but we do have still 2 parts to the workshop. Kingsley, I think it's a really, really important question, and a couple of others have also asked questions around journals where you're asked to pay for published model and the article processing charges and things like that. So I think that's a important and big topic that I think if we leave it till maybe the end of the last 40 minutes of the session, so we can have a full discussion around that, and I'll make a note of it to come back to it. So, but thank you so much for raising that. I think that's a really important one, and everyone else is also supporting a slightly longer discussion on it. So thank you. At this point, I would like to hand it over to Marcus, who will give us more for the actual structure of the papers and the outline of the papers and how to build your introduction and building an argument around it. So thank you so much, Parvati. Thank you, everyone, for that question. Over to Marcus, and then we'll have the second part starting. All right. Marcus, go on ahead.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So I will follow up on what Parvati has spoken about and talk a bit more in detail about how we set up the paper and how we build the argument. And I will mainly be talking about the paper that has a theoretical section as well as an empirical section. So not a purely conceptual paper, but talk a bit about how we bring those together. And Parvati already touched a bit on this in terms of not writing just empirical cases, but trying to make our findings more relevant to the wider academic community. And the reason for that is that, as she said, each empirical case is not necessarily interesting to anyone else. It might be interesting to a few people, but if you want to reach a wider audience, you have to think about how you set up the paper in a way that makes it relevant to them. And the way to do that is to engage with existing knowledge of the topic. So when we look at papers, we often see that people don't really engage with existing literature that is already out there. But I think it's very important to bring that literature into the paper, and that's the way for you to kind of familiarize yourself with the existing knowledge on the topic and the wider field. And based on that, you can identify the gap or the space where your paper fits in and where it contributes something new. So Parvati talked about this in relation to kind of a sense that something is not quite right. But as I know, Parvati, she will also engage with the literature to demonstrate that that problem exists and then use that problem to address it. So I think it's useful then to think about the structure of the paper, because the structure of the paper helps you construct your argument. We're not just putting an introduction and the various sections for no reason, but we have to think about how each component of the paper helps us construct that one argument we want to make in the paper. So that includes the title and the abstract and all the other parts. And they all we have to figure out how they help us make that broader point. But in addition to thinking about how it relates to the wider picture, we also have to think about how the argument emerges from our own data. We can't just make an argument because we disagree. We have to have the data to demonstrate that. So in most cases, that will mean we have collected data through some scientific method, and then we're using that to construct our argument in relation to the existing knowledge on the topic. And that's kind of the recipe to create an interesting contribution. But when we look at papers, we often see that people have maybe some theoretical background, but then it doesn't necessarily correspond to the empirical sections. And that kind of the incoherence in the papers then often ends with these policy recommendations that have been mentioned already. And these, when we have an incoherent paper with policy recommendations at the end, we end up with a paper that's not really very valuable. So to create an academic paper, we should move away from the policy recommendations, because, as mentioned, the people who will read this paper, they're not looking for the policy recommendations. They're looking for some theoretical input or to develop a new understanding that goes beyond a particular context. So the job of the academic article is to make a more complex argument that builds on the existing theory and knowledge on the topic, and where you use your empirical data to generate some sort of new insight. And as I mentioned, the structure is very important for this. And I will now talk you through kind of a basic structure of a paper, just to give you a sense of how I would set it up. And of course, this would have to be modified for each specific paper, but I think it's a useful starting point just to have something to work with, and then it can be developed further as you go along. So of course, the introduction is the starting point, and it does a very important job to kind of give the broader overview of what you're doing in this paper. But I will give you a kind of a way to do it where you use 5 basic paragraphs and each of them will do a specific thing. So what I would do is to start with a broader issue and demonstrate why it's important, and specifically why it's important to explore what you're going to focus on. So for example, if we are going to write about experiences of gender discrimination among international students in Ghana, then the first paragraph should not necessarily tell the reader that this is what you're going to focus on, but it could rather talk about gender discrimination in higher education or gender discrimination in other contexts, but to make the case that this is a major issue that has been addressed in various contexts. And then we should end that paragraph with making some sort of statement about why it's important to explore something and what we're going to do here. And then a second paragraph should then provide some sort of overview of how other authors have dealt with the topic. Because it could cover a lot, but I'm trying to say we need to narrow it down. But it doesn't have to be narrowed down by the context, but more by the broader topic or issue that we're going to focus on in the paper. Having done that, a third paragraph can then outline more of an approach of how you're going to address the issue of gender discrimination. Meaning, so you can tell us about how you understand it, or which concept or theoretical approach you're going to take to explore this issue in this particular paper. And then fourth, it's useful for the reader to get a sense of where the paper comes from. So is it part of your PhD research? Is it part of does it come from a large international project? And tell us about why you were exploring this in some detail, where the research was conducted, and the importance of this particular context. And this will just help the reader understand where you're coming from and why you're choosing to write about this. And then finally, you need to provide some sort of overview of, or bring together those first paragraphs and tell us where all of this takes us, and clearly state your research question in the form of an objective or aim, telling us what you're going to do in this paper and what that's gonna teach us. Because you're trying to tell us about something and we're going to learn about it. So you can't really reveal the final point in the introduction still. You have to kind of find the right balance so you can still keep the reader's interest and make them want to read the rest of the paper. So when we have set up the introduction, we can then move on to the next section, which in many cases should be a literature review or a theoretical framework. And this, we've touched upon it in the introduction already, but here we should go into some more detail to tell the reader what others have written about the topic, but also to set up a theoretical framework that will enable you to analyze your own empirical data in the later sections. So this section is not separate from the rest of the paper. We're not reviewing literature just to show that we understand it, but we're setting up for the empirical material so that we'll be able to discuss that in more depth when we get there. The exact kind of literature you review depend on the argument of the paper, of course. But if I go back to the example of gender discrimination among international students in Ghana, we don't want to review everything that has been written on gender discrimination. Instead, we need to identify the literature that relate to the specific aspects to help us understand the issue that we are exploring. So we want to do a review here, but it has to be very focused and specific because the section will be maybe 1,000 to 1,500 words. So you have to engage with the literature that's directly relevant to the point that you're making in the paper, and that will help you analyze the materials in the empirical sections. And by engaging with this literature, you're at the same time kind of establishing your own position, in relation to this literature. And so by reviewing this literature, you're at the same time demonstrating your own theoretical approach. So this is of course a bit abstract, but this is also something we're going to talk more about in the following workshops about how to write the literature review, but also how we make that connection between existing literature and theory and our own empirical materials. But when you've set up that section, you also need to tell us about your methodology. This is also important to do before you go to your own to the empirical sections. And this section demonstrates the reliability and the validity of the data you have collected. So it's really important to do this section really well, because reviewers will often point out if there are shortcomings here, because they really want to understand how you have generated the data for this paper. So it needs to tell us about the methods you used, the time you spent on it. Did you do research in Ghana for this particular example, or did you do it somewhere else? Did you focus on students on one specific university or many universities? How many men and women? Were they all from one country, and so on? So we need all the details here, so we understand how you have collected data and what it is based on, this paper. You should also mention issues of data management, how you analyze the data and the ethics of it. But I think here it's a good point to mention again that it depends on the journal. I think in many cases it's easiest to see that in the tailoring of journal articles. It's easiest to see that in the methodology, because they are often quite distinct in many journals. So when you start thinking about a journal, you should look at the methodology and see, because in some journals they want a really short and concise methodology, in others they want really long ones. I think that's very important to think about, but it's also something we'll talk more about later in terms of the tailoring for journals. So when we've set up those three first sections, then we have framed our paper. So that's almost half the paper, but then we've worked our way, and then finally we get to our own data. And there are many ways to organize the empirical data, but I think a useful ways to do it is to identify the key themes that are emerging from your findings, and then split them up into sections. And the purpose of that is to have separate sections that all speak to the broader argument. They're all adding something new to your argument. And the other point I want to make here is that these findings, we shouldn't, in most cases, I don't like that when we put findings or empirical material earlier in the paper, because that kind of confuses the flow of it. It is possible to do it, but it has to be done really well for it to work. If not, it might cause you problems instead. And another point I would like to make about the empirical sections is if we have conducted interviews, I find it really enriching if you have quotes from your research participants to illustrate your points. But when you use these quotes, you have to set it up with some sort of explanation and context to make it clear who is saying this and for what reason. And you have to spell it out to the reader how the quote contributes to the broader argument you want to make. So after each quote, you need some sort of analysis in terms of explanation of what the quote means and how it relates to the other data. So you can point to the patterns this particular quote represents, because we're talking in general, when we're writing, we want to talk about patterns of kind of broader trends, not just one individual who stands out. Of course, we can use those cases, but it's useful to think of the pattern that each quote represents. So going back to my gender discrimination example again, if I have a quote about that, then one example of some sort of relationship to a pattern, I could say, for example, if this was the case, that all the male participants had experienced gender-based discrimination, whereas none of the female participants had reported such experiences. This, it's a surprising finding, because we often think that women are more discriminated against. But if you make that point, then you can link that to the literature that you have presumably engaged with in the literature review to point out that this is a new and potentially interesting finding. And then I mentioned already that it usually works well to have 3 separate empirical sections, and that each of them should address one point each to build that broader argument. So again, if we're talking about gender discrimination, this could be organized in many ways, but just as an example, we could talk about the sections could be organized by where the discrimination takes place. If we've done lots of interviews and observation, we find that they are taking place in 3 specific places. We could split those sections up according to that. So we could talk about discrimination in the classrooms, in the library, and in the spaces where international students socialize. And then if we have those sections, we can then demonstrate how gender discrimination takes place in those spaces, in each of the sections. But they all point to the broader issue of the paper here, gender discrimination among international students. So, for example, if we have finding in one section where we talk about the classrooms, that women feel discriminated in classrooms, but men feel discriminated against in the libraries, we're showing different things in different sections, but we're talking about a broader issue with some surprising findings. So we can use these differences and we bring them together to make a larger argument about the complexity of discrimination among international students. Having then set up those sections, we move on to the conclusion. And here we're not trying to summarize or repeat what we've already said above, but we want to go into more detail and explain the importance of the findings in the empirical sections. So again, in our case of international students, we could here then explain more what it means that the victims of gender discrimination vary between different spaces. So this could lead us to suggest, for example, that the discriminations has very different meanings for men and women, or something like that. But we're using the empirical material to have some analysis in each of the empirical sections, but we go on to provide some sort of broader analysis in the conclusion. But this, again, is not separate, but we then point back and bring in the key literature we've engaged with earlier in the paper, which enable us to make it clear where our argument sits in relation to those and how it differs. And it's by doing this that we can demonstrate the added value of our insights to the readers. And based on this, that we can go beyond just providing an empirical example, but linking it to the wider debates in the field and make our paper a valuable contribution. Thank you. Over to you, Gunjan. Thanks
so much for that, Marcus. That's really, really helpful, and I think a really good overview of an academic paper. We already have a whole host of questions that people have been sending out. I'll read them, and if they're unclear, I could, so those people who've asked the questions, they can then, clarify the point further. So I can certainly introduce the questions that way, and then the people who've asked the questions can clarify it further. And do feel free to ask other questions or raise your hand, and I'll keep an eye out for that. So first we've got, again, my apologies for mispronouncing everyone's name, Olusogun. The question is, what should be the focus of an early academic researcher who aims at becoming an international figure and makes indelible impact in their field of study? So should such a person focus on publishing in journals which are recommended by institutions for promotion, or targeting publishing in journals for high impact? So I think it's a question both for Marcus and for Parvati. In a way, is what advice do you give early career researchers, academic researchers, in how to decide on the journals, high impact factor versus what's recommended by the institutions?
Parvati, will you go ahead?
Yeah, I can try. I guess it's hard for us because here very often the high impact journals are also the ones that people look for in terms of the career and promotion. They're not different. So it is not so easy to differentiate. So I'd love to hear from you, Olusegun, before what journals they ask you to publish in. But one of the things which is really important is to think about audiences, right? What do you want to achieve? What's an international figure for you, right? For me, an international figure would be if I was quite well known by African academics. I'd be very happy with that. Yeah, I don't necessarily want to be known by Europeans. So what is well known for you may be different. You need to also identify that. The thing to say here in terms of publications is a journal, it doesn't almost matter. No, there is a relationship between the citations of your paper and the citations of a journal, but it is not wholly direct. They don't directly map onto each other. So my best referred to best cited journal articles are in journals where they were speaking to the audience I was writing to, right? There are many articles on that topic in that journal, and there will be many more. So I write a piece, and there are say 40 articles on that topic, and then I write a piece. Then the next 40 articles in that journal all cite my paper. They don't always cite the previous 40, but they do cite mine. Yeah. And I have a couple of such papers like that. And that's what has led me to become relatively well known in that field. It is because I have written into the right journal for my article. It's not the journal with the highest impact factor. That's not what happened. The other thing that is important to say is the difference between disciplinary and interdisciplinary. So migration studies is often an interdisciplinary activity, and you can have journals which are into which people write who are often coming from multiple disciplines. If you look at something like Population, Space and Place or Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, you will have people who are writing from sociology, social policy, anthropology, geography, probably sometimes less so history, but a range of demography. There'll be multiple, disciplinary affiliations from which people write. So you have to also think, what does international mean to you? So I work with Chidi, Chidi's supervisor, Melis. Now, Melis actually writes all the time in Turkish as well as in English, because she says international for me means being well known in Turkey, which is my home country, right? I need to make sure that my home country audiences still follow me, even though I don't live there. So for her, international is writing back to that country. For me, it is, I want to be known in India and I want to be relatively known in Africa as well, right? So I will often say yes to things when there are invitations to write there. The other thing to note, and I don't know if this is true in Africa, but it's definitely, I think, true in India, is that in India, books are very important. It's not always journal articles, right? And in the long run, books often have more citations than articles. It depends on the type of book. Overview books, which are pieces of authority, which both round up the literature but also extend it, have far more citations ultimately. And on average, books have more citations than an average journal article. So you need to think about, what does international mean? The fact that the impact factor may or may not matter. Because if you want to be well recognized, it is you who's recognized, not the journal. And for you to be recognized, your paper has to be recognized. Your paper must speak to a very large audience and should be generalizable, should be something that is conceptual, or very often conceptual, but which travels, right? Somebody in, so one of the papers that I've written, which is traveled relatively well, is called a paper called Theorizing the Spaces of International Student Migration. Some of you would have seen this elsewhere, but it's traveled very well. And people, when they start to do international student migration, are often asked to read this. So I have had people from Japan, from many parts of the world, from Latin America, all saying, we found this very useful, we used it. And then you also become famous because people put it into their reading lists as part of their teaching, right? So when you want to become an international figure, the factors are somewhat slightly different. Then you also need to think, are you trying to be an international figure in a policy world, or in the Inej and I, for instance, work with some colleagues who are very famous in the policy world, but probably have slightly less impactful journal articles, right? So I probably have far more citations than them, but they are much more influential in the policy world. So you need to think about what international means to you. Where do you want to make the difference? Life on Earth is short. You need to make the difference where it means something to you.
Thanks very much, Carl. We'll take a couple of the questions that are already there, and then I think Marcus has got a third component that he'll come to as well, which we'll try to wrap it up because I'm very aware of the time. So the next question is from Amina, and that's very specific to the literature reviews, which says, do I need to review few literatures in my introduction, or can I make it as a result of my initial findings? So as to what purpose literature reviews and where they fit in. Before I let Marcus answer this further, also a plug-in for our next seminar for February, particularly, that we'll be circulating, which will be specifically on literature reviews. How do you go about searching? What purpose what's the purpose? And how how do they fit into the whole into an academic research paper? So Marcus, if you want to take that, so do you need a few literature reviews in the introduction, or can it be a result of the initial findings?
I'm not sure I understand the question completely. Sorry.
Amina, if you are still there, would you like to unmute yourself and maybe clarify the question a bit more?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, my question is usually I believe before I say I want to write something, aside the fact that maybe there's a call for article, I have something in mind. Say I want to research about gender-based violence. Maybe it's based from what I have seen, either experience or reality. Did I have to review literatures in my introduction? That's just the question. Or I just have to say, okay, I want to carry out this research due to the fact that in the northern Nigeria about this, the rough statistics I get from my previous work, or I have to review literature, or I have to base it on my previous work experience? That's the question.
Okay, I think so for the introduction, I think it is very useful to give us, you can also bring in statistics, of course, that's a compelling case, if you have some interesting statistics. But I think it's useful to engage with some sort of literature in the introduction just to help the reader understand how your paper is situated in relation to the existing knowledge on the topic.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Marcus. The next question is Noel, I believe. Their question is, how do you bring in a persuasive view in building an argument, and how is it different from a balanced view? Noel, would you like to, if you're still online, would you like to clarify or explain the question a bit more?
Yes, I was usually now when he was presenting. Usually, when you have to bring in when you are building an argument, you must be persuasive, and you must have a different and you must have a balanced view. So I would like to know which one do you bring first, or when do you bring what?
Thank you. I think I get your question, but Parvati, you want to elaborate on how? Because I think we're making arguments when we write, but it's just about how we engage with existing knowledge and how we construct that argument. And I think the most efficient way is not to state I argue this and argue that and trying to persuade us, but you have to use the text to make the data speak for themselves so that we will be convinced by what you're saying. But Parvati, maybe you want to.
Is that Noel?
Oh, yeah.
Hi, Noel. He's our new Ugandan colleague on another project.
Yes.
Great to see you. No, not Ugandan, sorry. Yes, Ugandan.
Ugandan, yeah.
Sorry. How do I bring in a persuasive view in building an argument, and how is it different from a balanced view? So I think it depends on what do you understand by a balanced view and a persuasive view. So a persuasive view is when you when you persuade somebody to adopt your balanced view, right? So for me, a lot of it is about the framing, right? And one of the things that I think is really important when you think about, when you're writing a paper and you're doing your analysis is, are you actually analyzing in the right frame, right? Let me give you an example. And it's an example that I've used in the past because it was something which troubled me. So a colleague of mine who works in Montserrat in the Caribbean said to me that people are told to hold elections regularly, yeah, and they have referendums about whether they want to get independence from Britain or whether they want to remain a colony, right? Now, they have had multiple referenda, and every time they have voted to stay a colony. Now, the question is, what do you read from this, right? You can read from this, you can say, yes, they voted to remain a colony. Therefore, colonialism is not a bad thing, right? Or they like to remain colonial, right? That is one way of looking at it because that is what the evidence is telling you, right? But a balanced view would look at it and say, yes, because the Montserratians are not crazy. They know that being independent in the contemporary world is even worse, right? And that there are really political economic reasons why Montserrat might be benefiting from actually being a colonial rather than an extremely small island country in the Caribbean, right? Which will have very little ability to wield any kind of international power. So for me, a balanced view is about not saying what you see, but actually analyzing why people might have made that decision, right? Another example, let me give you, is that when I did my PhD 30 years ago or thereabouts, 27 actually, I was interviewing some women, and they said that the women who seemed the happiest, according to some scale that I built, were the people who had no control over household expenses or decision making. They were the happiest. They seemed to be the most well settled. And I was thinking, oh, why are they happy when they have no control? Then it made me think about it. And I thought, when you have so little money, because I was looking at very poor people, and when you don't have much ability to actually spend much, not having responsibility to make those decisions that you don't have much, you don't have to think, oh, within this 5 rupees, how am I going to manage? You don't have, it's your husband's problem to think about that. Either he needs to go with more money or he decides how to spend it and he gives you everything. So to say that actually women are happy because they don't have to do anything, because that they don't want to control money is not the problem. The problem is that actually within the context of very little money, control doesn't matter. Actually, not having control is better because in some ways you don't have responsibilities of managing with very little. A balanced view consists of looking at the frame. So I often think of this as the frame. And then I say twisting this it can be both persuasive, but also insightful, right? Sometimes it's about you don't look at it things like this, but you look out and see it in a larger frame, like in the Montserratian case. It's not that the Montserratians like colonialism, it's that they don't like the alternative, which is even worse. So if you don't look at that alternative, you will not be able to put in the right frame. So you must always look, is this the right frame or is that the right frame? Is this the right frame or is that the right frame, right? So you need to do this work to get the balanced view, and that balanced view will be persuasive. So it's not a choice between the two.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Well understood now. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you so much for that, Parveen. Thank you so much for that, Noel. So we've got one other question from Inesh. Inesh, would you like to ask the question yourself? If you just unmute yourself, that might be easier. And then I think after that, I'll let Marcus do his last little bit. And I've been told that I need to bring up one particular point, that I'll do so as well. And then we can have more of a general discussion as we are doing. So Nash, if you'd like to ask your question.
Yes, please. Thank you very much. Yes. My question is about the literature, because most of the literature and most of the journals, the best journals, are in English. But some of us, English is not our first language. You need a second or sometimes third language. So, and sometimes when I write, I really use literature for my language, which is Portuguese. So my question is it acceptable to use this literature, considering that many people are not aware about that?
So there are two questions here. One of them is about the language, and the other thing is about the framing. All right. So the question that I would ask is that why would you want to write into an English language journal about this? If you know that you want to write into an English language journal, you probably need to also be engaging with some English language literature, because that's the literature you're writing back to, right? Like I said, when I've seen 40 papers about something, I'm writing into that journal saying that, sorry, you were wrong. Or, sorry, I think my case study can teach you something totally different and can make you think differently. Yeah. Or can provide a totally different form of evidence which will really stretch you and make you think differently. So if you're reading in Portuguese, why would you not want to write back in Portuguese in those journals, right? So that's the first question that I would say. The second thing is, practically speaking, there is nothing to say that you shouldn't be using some Portuguese references or Swahili or Hausa or whatever. And nowadays, actually, sometimes people also use these to show authenticity. And I sometimes laugh, and I will find some English colleagues of mine. They will use 3 or 4 Hindi words in their journal articles to show a mark of authenticity. And I'm thinking, what on earth? Why do you need to use those Hindi words? But it's to make some claim of attachment to India or something like that, or to show, oh yes, I know what I'm talking about. No, those are just tricks to suggest that I have the right to write about India, right? So, but people do this. So if white British people can use those tactics, I think, okay, so can I use those tactics? Yeah, I can also use sometimes the Hindi words if it is meaningful, if it adds something that nothing else can do. So there are times when you will have, and in my current project, as some of you are from that project, we will be doing that because we are looking at local values and knowledges. And then sometimes a word can mean much more in the language, and there is no equivalent English word. So does that help?
Can I just add, maybe, I think there is some value, if you're engaging primarily with the literature in Portuguese. I don't think we have to see them as separate, but, so if there is a debate going on in Portuguese journals, and if you want to add that to existing debates in English language journals, I think that's you can add a lot by bringing in some of that literature, but it has, as Parvati said, also to engage with the broader literature in English to make it work.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Anash, and thank you, Parvati and Marcus. I realise we may not get to Kingsley's question, but I think we'll keep that at the end after you've covered some of the common issues. Marcus, do you want to go over your slides?
Sure. So we had a meeting some time ago, and we discussed kind of what the common issues are that we find in articles. And we thought we'd just talk you through them, because those are things that are useful to deal with before you submit. And we've mentioned this already, and the first one is about that the paper is about more than one thing. The paper should have, in general, one argument and make one very strong point, drawing on all your materials. But in many papers, we see that you're trying to do too many things at the same time, making kind of 2 arguments or maybe even 3 arguments, which makes it confusing for the reader. And Parvati is smiling, and that's because she tries to do too many things. Do you want to add something to that point? No?
No, I just wanted to say that I'm one of the persons who does this. And my colleague always says to me, how many times have I told you, write your paper on one thing? but then my paper gives birth to another paper because I divide it into two, then I divide it into two more, but to try to keep the one concept, but it just grows and grows. So, but yeah, it's a problem. It's a problem I still have. So just to say that sometimes you have styles of writing and it's hard to break out of those styles. Sorry, Marcus.
No, great. And the second one is about presenting findings without analysis. And by that we mean in the empirical sections, we often see people you found lots of interesting things and you want to share it and you want people to read it, but it ends up just being kind of listing of empirical material without making the broader connections to the existing literature and kind of telling us the importance of these examples and explaining them to us, because quotes and empirical examples in themselves, they don't necessarily tell us much. They need some sort of analysis. Parvati?
No, I actually, this was an interesting case as well, because I think we sent Marcus some paper that we had written, and he said to me, I don't like to have a quote and then not have some follow-on text after that. So if you have a quote, you must have some follow-on text to explain what that quote is. And again, we had written what was there in the beginning, but we had put in the quote, then we did not go back to what the quote was saying again. And he said, that's not good enough. You need to do it both to begin the quote, and then you put the quote, and then you come back and say, what does this mean? So you need to you need to surround it with your analysis on both sides. No, Marcus, you remember?
Yeah, that's right. Because we often see that papers, maybe one section will end with a quote. I don't like that, because then it leaves everything, and then you start something else. You really need to finalize each section or paragraph before you move to the rest. And so if you just end it with a quote, it's kind of, you leave us hanging, and it's kind of an incomplete paragraph or section, I would say. The third point is about statements about culture without critical reflection. This is a bit complicated maybe, but sometimes in papers we see that people would tell us about something is like this, and that's based on your local knowledge, and it might be like that, but if you don't qualify it or problematize it, that will make the reader question your whole analysis if you're kind of presenting cultural facts about a country or about an ethnic group or a practice. Parvati, help me out here. I'm struggling to explain it.
Yeah, no, this was actually, both of us had reviewed papers the previous week, and both of us came up with the same problem, in that we saw a paper where somebody said, oh, women are passive and submissive usually, and therefore they don't engage in crimes. Actually, none of that is true. Women are not always passive or submissive, and I'm a case in point. But it's really important to not generalize. And one of the things which struck us both, I think Marcus and me, is that, and Marcus said, oh yeah, I also got a statement saying that Muslims are like this or something. Typically what happens is you are reading off an entire group, like all of femalehood in the entire world, based on your case study of 30 Ghanaian women. Yeah, that doesn't work, because all of the women in the world, like there are 3 billion of them, are not going to be like your 30 Ghanaian women, right? So you can't read off such big things. And the problem with this is not the one sentence alone. The problem is the minute you have a sentence like this, your entire paper becomes seen as problematic. People say, oh, they're writing things without really reflecting it, and immediately it goes into a major revision, because then people will start looking at it and saying, they haven't really thought, they've just said something because it sounds right? Or because it's a generalization. So absolutely avoid generalizations, because if you have these kinds of really inappropriate generalizations, people will question your whole paper.
Thank you. And the last one was citation of materials that are not relevant. And by that I mean, we want to have an expansive bibliography in our paper, but it should only be materials that are directly relevant to what we're trying to do in the paper, not adding citations that do not help create our particular argument. Okay. And then we talked a bit about solutions before submitting the paper and how to kind of avoid the desk rejection. And we talked about the importance of printing the paper and reading it on paper rather than reading it on the screen. For me, that's really helpful. When I read my papers on paper, I find problems in every sentence. If I look at it on the screen, I find problems in every 10 sentences. So it's really to step away from the computer, sit in a different space. It really helps to see the problems in your own papers. I really recommend that. Another practice is to present the paper to other people, to really think through it, because if you have a presentation that's 10 or 15 minutes, you have to make it very clear what the point is. And if you write a PowerPoint or whatever you do, that really helps you narrow it down and make it clear. So when you do that presentation, it might be useful to get feedback, but it might not be useful. But just the practice of doing it will help you sharpen your argument. And the third one was about creating a checklist. Parvati, you want to talk about this one?
Yeah, actually, we are going to do a checklist. Is that right, Gunjan?
Yes. So what we're going to try and do, based on our discussions and these seminars, is try and produce checklists for various components of what to keep in mind when you're thinking about these academic papers. So if there are any things, this is also a request for everyone, is if there are any particular things that you would like highlighted in a checklist, do send me an email, do get in touch with us, so that we can keep a track of that. Because the aim of the funded project, which we haven't been able to do, which was the in-person workshop, was also to produce toolkits that people can use while they're writing these, which are, in retrospect, are useful for us as much as it is for everyone who's in the workshop as well. Because there are times when I certainly forget lots of things when I'm writing. So it'd be useful to have your feedback on that as well. So that would be good.
But just to mention a few examples, you can check, for spelling. If you're using a local concept for some reason, make sure you spell it the same way throughout the paper. Don't spell it one way here and one way there, because then the reader will think you're talking about different things. Another checklist point could be, have I cited enough African scholars, or am I citing only Europeans? Have I cited any women, or I'm basing my whole research on what men have written about gender discrimination? So it could be lots of things, but as you're writing the paper, you can't always keep all these things in your mind. So it's good to have a list of these things to make sure that you're creating the kind of paper you want to create. And that's also related to the next point about checking your references. So who are you citing? Citing, I think there has been more awareness of it in the last years in terms of the political implications of who you are citing. And as I mentioned, we should be aware of who we are citing and what kind of knowledge we are reproducing. I'm sure Parvati has a point on that one as well.
No, I think this is the key thing, that sometimes there is something here about making sure that you didn't miss out a very big reference. There is some politics around citations. So for instance, I know that so at a practical level, when I review a paper, the editors are sending me the paper because they think that I am an authority in this field or know this field. Typically, so how do say if it is on something to do with international students and Indians, it might come to me, or if it's an international students and gender, and it will often go to Gunjan, right? So the practicality of it is that you need to think, did you cite Gunjan? Yeah, not because you need to cite her and she's going to say, oh, has she cited me? But it's because Gunjan has written something which has really changed the field, right? She's talked about comparative methods. She's talked about many things which are really so insightful. And you need to build on that. So one of the things that I think is also about why are we writing? We're writing because we want to grasp the world better. And we want the world to grasp the world better, to understand what's happening in the world better. So you're citing people who have already contributed to those insights of the world, right? And you're saying they have done all of this, but we think that we can build on that work in order to do more, right? If you think that all these people didn't do anything, then you're not building a better world. Yeah, you're forgetting that there's already so much of good work that has happened, right? And recently, this is also true for, grant applications or for PhD applications and so on and so forth. We're looking at somebody's. First thing I did is I did a Google search for that topic, and I found 8 references on a topic on which somebody says there is no research. Immediately, I will say, this person hasn't done their homework. This is a desk reject, right? Because remember, the editor is not going to know your specialist field. What they will know is the broad area. Yeah. What they will do is they'll look at the Google citations or something, and they'll say, who's the name which comes up top of my head, whom I have to send it out to? Or who should I send it to review? And I see the paper and it says, there's no work on such and such topic. Put the keywords in the Google Scholar, find there are 10 papers on that topic. Then I think they haven't even, and then I'll say, okay, have they cited these people? No, they haven't. In that case, this paper is not worth, they've clearly not done the reading. They're not building on the existing literature. So let's just desk reject it, right? So even if one of the things, practical things you can do is put your keywords into Google Scholar, see what comes up, 1 or 2 words at a time. See what comes up. See, have you read the right things? Have I missed out on things? Yeah.
I think it's important to have the right balance then. So we have to cite some of the key figures, but also bring in some other voices somehow. But you have to find the right balance between them and not lean too much on one or the other, I guess. And then finally, a very important point, I think, is about working with colleagues and getting feedback on your paper before you submit it to a journal. Because your colleague, you might not work in exactly the same field if they have some experience, or even if they don't have much experience, just by getting their input and their criticism, that will help you improve your paper before you submit it, and that might help you avoid the desk rejection.
Great. Thanks so very much for that, Marcus. I just wanted to add one point to the last 2 points in terms of your references. I think you should also consider people who do you want to engage with as well. So, right? So there's a whole body that, yes, you've got so many people, especially when it comes to, certain international student literature, for example, gender and migration. There's a whole host. And in that, you may filter out certain groups because they're relevant to your study, but also which is the group that you want to actually actively engage with or speak to. And part of these mentioned that before, right? So what literature are you talking to is also about the people that you want to engage with and their works actively. Are you writing alongside them? Are you writing contrary or critiquing their work? That also goes into shaping your references literature. A particular point which it sort of some of the solutions and some of the issues, but something more practically to keep in mind when you're writing your paper, and especially when you're ready to submit it, is you have to think about how your paper will be picked up and who will read it. And this isn't a question about your audience, but it's a question about how do you write your title, how do you write your abstract, and how do you construct your first paragraph. And there has to be, and you have to think about the technology. So there was an earlier question around Scopus and how does Scopus feed up. So the bots and the algorithms that will pick up your paper are trained to pick up particular things. They're trained to pick up your keywords which are in your paper, but those keywords have to be repeated in your title. Those keywords have to be repeated in your abstract, and those keywords have to be present in the first 3 sentences of your very first paragraph. And that's how your paper will get picked up by whether it's Scopus bots or Google Scholar bots or whatever else, or Web of Science, all the various indices will pick it up by saying things. And so you have to make sure. So you will get, you'll come across papers, you'll be like, well, this isn't a brilliant paper, and yet it's coming up repeatedly in your search results. Why is that the case? Well, they've been very strategic in how they've done that bit, which is your search engine optimization. So, which seems a bit ridiculous when you think about it, because you've got to optimize your paper to be picked up by bots. But if you want it to be read, that has to be thought through as well. And something very practical to think in mind, because sometimes you can have the most brilliant piece, but it will not come up on search results. And it takes a while for the search results to come up, right? So if you've just published a paper and you're not someone like Parvati who's published paper and the paper gets picked up very quickly, it will take a while for your paper to rise up in the rankings of Google Scholar searches or Scopus searches. But if you take these very strategic steps of making sure your keywords are aligned with your abstract, are present in your title, and present in the first 3 sentences of your very first paragraph of the paper, that will get picked up much faster and your search results get picked up. And people will they will use your paper as well because it's coming up in the search results. So I was told to put that point in. Parvati, you've been responding to questions in the chat, which has been really helpful. Thanks for that. I realize we are technically at the end of the seminar, but I thought if people don't mind hanging around for a bit longer, I do want to come back to the point that Kingsley had raised initially, which was on how the journals, particularly the pay-for-publish model, and the issues around open access and the valid open access versus some of the other fake open access publishing or the predatory publishing journals that are there. So Parvati, if you had any thoughts on that, Marcus, you as well, and my thought on that is I'm on the editorial board for an open access journal at the Open University, which looks at gender, science, and technology, and it's fully open access in that it's not affiliated with a formal publishing company. And we don't charge for publishing, right? So but it's also an open access journal that's picked up by the industry, and by the nature of what it is, it's picked up by the industry because it's on gender and science and technology. So and it's open globally, so anyone from anywhere around the world can send us pieces in. It's run by volunteers, and us being one of the volunteers. So the publishing model is slower in that it will take much longer because there are only a handful of us working on it. We don't have a whole machine working on it. But you have to double check when you do this that what kind of open access it is. And versus what Parvati said is open access, which is different from the APC. What's APC, Parvati? I don't know. Do you want to elaborate on that?
It's journals which have author processing charges. And so many journals, and you will see soliciting journals, especially from Malaysia and Thailand, sometimes from China, who will say, oh, we really want you to publish with us. Will you be happy to publish with us? And they'll send you and it will often be quite broad, like International Journal of Social Sciences and Humanities or something like that, right? And then you say, oh, wow. And this happened to a niece of mine, and her mother said, wow, she's got a offer to publish. Somebody has written to her personally saying, oh, that they want her to publish with them. Isn't that great? No, it isn't, because after 5 minutes, you see that you will have to pay to publish, right? It is just a business. And it is also very general. So International Journal of Social Sciences and Humanities is like the whole world, right? All of international plus all subjects, right? So who's going to read that? Not the people whom you're writing back to. And do you read it? You don't very often, right? So if you haven't read the journal, you really need to think, is this the journal for me, right? So think about what you're reading, what you're finding useful, and then think, if I want to write back into that journal, what do I want to do? So think of yourself not only as a writer, but also a reader, right? If you're not reading International Journal of Social Sciences and Humanities, then nobody else is either.
They're very clever. They try to flatter you and to trick you out of money. But I know people are not that interested in me. So if I get an invitation like that, I know it's not true. But there are also lists, I think, of predatory journals. So it's a good idea. If you have any doubts, you should really search, and you shouldn't pay any money. That's a clear indication of people trying to make money out of you rather than actually publishing your paper in a productive way.
There are exceptions, however, I have to also say. There are exceptions, like, for instance, there is a Royal Geographical Society journal called GeoJournal, which does have APC, but it basically picks up articles which other geographical journals have decided not to publish or don't think is relevant to them. it is still considered quite an important journal, and it is an open access journal, but it is open access because of APC. So basically, in any form, what you have to realize is somebody has to pay. There is no such thing as a free lunch. So the question is the author paying, or is the buyer who's going to read the paper paying, right? If it is the buyer who's paying, generally the reader who's paying, it is generally a better journal. If the author is paying, it is usually a worse journal. But of course, nowadays through academia.edu or through ResearchGate or through other things, many articles are available for free. And you can also write to authors and ask them, look, I want this paper for such and such reason. I think it's going to really do something for my work. And most people, I think, will reply to you and send you the paper. So they won't send you whole books. They will often send you a chapter from a book, for instance. So people will send you things, because one thing is they're also happy. Oh, look, somebody is reading my work.
True. Thank you so much for that, Parvati and Marcus. Are there any final questions that anyone would like to ask? Any that the people are absolutely burning questions? If not, we're about 10 minutes over the time. Oh, we've got one question. Sorry, Parvati. We've got a question from Julius, which says, in the academic world, how the issue of article publication charges be waived completely, especially if you're coming as an up-and-coming young researcher. So I think it's just a follow-up comment from Julius. Julius, if you'd like to unmute yourself and speak, that's fine as well. You'd just like to follow up on the point you've made. But I think his main point is that it might be, these kind of publications might be preventing younger and early career researchers from publishing as well. With the APC model. So right, okay. So as I was saying is we do have a series planned. So next month we'll have a discussion, another seminar like this, but focusing on literature reviews. And part of that might be just introducing you to bibliographic management software as well, not necessarily demonstration, but just letting you know how to go about managing some of your literature review collection and link, and how is the literature review actually embedded within the paper? What role does it play, especially in relation to the theory and the empirical, which is what some of the questions I think today have revolved around. Is how do we manage that? And to be honest, it's something that I certainly struggle with all the time as well in my writing. So we'll engage with some of that for the next session, and another session is planned on dealing with issues around how do you respond to the feedback from reviewers. Again, something that's come up in the questions today as well. So those are at least the two immediate ones that we have planned. We will have another seminar series as well on some of the work that we are working on. And if you have any questions or any themes that you think need covering, do get in touch with us, let us know, and we'll try our best to try and accommodate and see whether we need to add into the session or if we need to plan another full session for this. So I just want to say a massive thank you to everyone who's attended and who stayed on for about 15 minutes that we've run over. It's been really, it's been very exciting, and we're very excited to see that there's been so much interest on this. But also really helpful for us to really reflect on our practices and how we write and how we have to think about doing, writing academic papers. So as a result of these discussions, I know I'll certainly be doing things slightly differently. So it's been very helpful for that, and I hope it's been helpful for you to think through some of your practices and how you can do this. As I said, we will be providing some checklists. We will be putting the recording up for this over the next few days. Once we've got this edited, Parvati assures me she wants to do this, so we'll let Parvati edit the video. And we will also be circulating the certificate of participation as I said earlier. And lastly, we will also send out a survey for you to feedback on. So it'd be great to get your comments and feedback on this to see what's worked, what's not worked, and what we can do better for the next seminar session. So massive thank you to everyone, and particularly to Parvati and Marcus, and to everyone who's attended. So thank you so much.
Thanks to Gunjan for holding it together and for organizing it all, but also for her really important comments on the practices of writing. So thank you. And thanks to everyone for your questions and for coming in today.